You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom. Welcome to this week's SLA Insights. I'm Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I have a very special guest with me, Ms. Katie Lewis, who is going to be talking with us. She's an SLA practitioner and will be talking with us about her experience using comprehensible input in the classroom. For the last few episodes, I've been covering comprehensible input in various details, and so I wanted to talk with somebody who's doing it and using it and how she's using it. So let's start with, tell me about your training in terms of how you got to where you are now.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm so glad to get to be here today. My name is Katie Lewis, and I first actually began my journey in second language acquisition through doing my master's degree. My master's degree is in teaching English as a foreign language. The primary focus of my degree program was on second language acquisition. That was then applied to teaching adult English language learners.
Great. And so now how are you using it?
Yeah. So at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm actually teaching middle school Spanish. I teach 7th and 8th grade exploratory Spanish. So even though they've had exposure to Spanish before, this is really the opportunity where we're trying to get them to a point where they can communicate a little bit more in Spanish.
Great. Great. So then specifically related to comprehensible input, how has that been a part of your training up to this point?
So when I did my master's degree, this was in the early 2000s, and comprehensible input was definitely a part of my training program, but I would describe it as one part. We looked at all the different second language acquisition theories at the time, even ones that had since been kind of rejected or maybe older theories, to really gain a framework and an understanding of how people learn a second language and first language for that matter. And so while it was definitely one aspect and something that I incorporated into my teaching, I really think my program focused on more grammar and context. So definitely still had this idea of providing, within the context of language, but very grammar specific. I saw some downsides to that when it actually came to helping my students in communication. And so now that I've come back into the world of language learning after a few years of being away from the classroom, then now I've chosen to make comprehensible input a main focus of my classroom environment at the moment. So what that's done is it's led me on this journey of sort of diving back into second language acquisition, really understanding comprehensible input in a new way, specifically in the world language classroom. And I've done a lot of, my own independent research and taken some online classes to really get myself up in what the most current research is on comprehensible input.
Okay, great. Thank you. So tell me what you're doing with it, specifically now in your Spanish classroom, now that you've really gained a more depth of understanding of comprehensible input. How do you make use of it?
Yeah. So when I came into the classroom for 7th grade Spanish, I made the decision that I was going to focus primarily on that communication piece. So my goal is that we are speaking in Spanish the majority of the time. So for my students, they're not living in an environment where they really have a lot of exposure to Spanish, which is our target language in this case. And so therefore, I am really that main source for them. So 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week for one semester is really their exposure to the language. And so my desire is to provide as much language input as I can within that classroom environment. So a lot of that is coming through readings. We're doing a lot of story, conversation, obviously, that we're having to some degree. And then, also through different activities that we're doing with those stories in class. So they're getting a lot of verbal input from me that they're listening, but they're also getting a lot of reading input that perhaps on my slides or on handouts for them, all really rich in that language. So even when we're talking about culture, for example, which is a huge part of second language, exposure, when we're studying, say, on Mexico, I'm intentionally providing that information in Spanish at a level that's comprehensible to them, so that even when they're thinking about something like culture, we're still doing that within the target language and taking advantage of that opportunity.
Great. And what about when you have input that might be a little too difficult? How do you gauge that? Where's your target?
Yeah, my target is that when I give them a reading, I want them to be able to understand 90% of it if possible. Now, my kids are at different levels, so some are going to maybe have higher ability than others. But for the most part, that's what I'm aiming for, because that 10% that they're reaching for is already going to be taxing on them. If I give them too much within one activity or reading that is beyond what they can do, there'll come a point where they won't be able to process any of it. So I try to make sure 90% of it is comprehensible to them already. And then I'm adding 10% on top of that maybe new information that they're understanding from context through my charades, through the images that may be on a slide or on the reading, something that's going to help them understand additional text.
Great. Thank you. So I guess the question we would like to know, does it work?
Does it work? Yeah. Okay, so this has actually been a really exciting season for me, because I knew the theory and I was in favor of the research. I could see it. I believed it. But I was a believer in theory and not yet in practice. But I had known from my previous language teaching experience that I didn't feel like what I was doing was hitting that mark. And so I really wanted to get comprehensive input. Its genuine shot and really embrace it. And so when I started out with my 7th grade class, I had one semester and it was, input. I could see that they were understanding. There was a lot of comprehension, but they weren't necessarily producing the language just yet. They were in that silent period.
And you weren't expecting them
I wasn't expecting them. I never asked them to respond to me in the target language. If they responded to me in English, I would restate what they said in the target language. And I would make sure that everybody understood what that was. So there was lots of that, but I never required it. What I discovered is that after the students got to a point where that basically language saturation was happening, they were starting to produce it without me asking them to do that. So in the second half of the semester, I did an activity that was an interview. So each student had pre-prepared some slides that shared about their family, different topics that we had been discussing. They had other paragraphs that they had been reading, and this was their chance to give their own biography, so to speak. But we did it in an interview style. So it wasn't that they just had to memorize and present, but that I would ask them a question and then they would, respond to me with what I knew they could do. So after doing a couple of those where I'm asking the questions, both the ones that I had told them I was going to ask, as well as some follow-up questions like, is your brother older or younger? Then, after a few of those, what surprised me is that the students in my classroom actually began asking those questions. They would just raise their hand and they would say, hey, I want to know, and they would ask in the target language, is your brother older or younger? Is your dog big or small? Things that they wanted to know. And I do have, of course, posters in my room that has a lot of those language support. And so they would quickly be looking and they would ask me and they would ask one another, but they were excited about finding out from their classmate. And so they were figuring out how to ask those follow-up questions. And that was really exciting to me to see that when they got to the point where they were comfortable, they didn't need me to tell them to ask. They just did. 7th graders just doing that on their own really took me by surprise.
Yeah, that's great. So what would you find most challenging?
Yeah, I think by far the most challenging aspect of teaching with comprehensible input is that when the students first walk into my classroom and I'm, giving them the syllabus and explaining how my class is going to be set up, I'm immediately letting them know that it's going to be different, perhaps, than what they're expecting. So the first one is that we're going to be speaking in the target language. I'm going to be speaking in the target language. We're going to be reading in the target language. And for some students, that immediately feels like a barrier that they're like, I can't do that. They've been told that they can't do that. And so I am working very hard on day one to overcome that barrier. So we do 10 minutes of the syllabus and the remaining 30 minutes of my class, we are in the target language on day one. And I am making sure that they are going to have a lot of success with that first day. And by the time they are done, the excitement is palpable because they have just discovered I can learn another language. I actually did understand what was happening in class today. And that gives them a lot of encouragement to come back. Now, that fades after a couple of weeks when we start to get a little bit harder. They need to be reminded again that they're capable. So we do have to kind of hit that a few times where they can see how much they're learning and see how much they understand. But I think overcoming that initial belief that I can't learn a second language is number one. The second thing that I often see with my students is that if they've already had a language class in the past, they have an expectation about what a language classroom should look like. They're expecting me to give them vocabulary lists to memorize. They're expecting me to give them grammar sheets that they then have to memorize that content and regurgitate that on a quiz or a test. Well, my classroom doesn't look like that. My classroom looks like a lot of story, a lot of conversation, a lot of games and activities and getting up out of our chair and walking around the room doing different things or responding to prompts, by physically moving in some way. And so I'm not asking them to do that. And so I do have some students who kind of are critiquing whether I'm a real language teacher. Is this a real language class? Because I'm not fitting in that traditional model that they're expecting. And so I've had to say to a few of those, okay, I just need you to give me a chance. Like, just give me a couple weeks where, just give me a chance. And inevitably, those students discover they didn't even realize how much they were engaging with the class because they're not even thinking about, I'm learning a language. They're thinking about the topic that we're discussing. Their enthusiasm jumps in. Their brain just wants to be able to communicate about that topic. And then they sit back and think, whoa, I didn't realize I knew this word, this word, this word, this word, because I didn't hand them a vocabulary list at the beginning. But because it just becomes so much a part of the environment of the room, the kids are learning beyond what they expected, and that's really exciting.
That's great. That's great. So you and all of us in our language teaching are kind of in process.
100%.
Where do you see yourself, and what do you do with it?
Yeah. I feel that for me, coming into this and learning to teach using comprehensible input does put kind of expectations on me to learn some things, right? So I have to get good at my storytelling. I have to be mindful of communicating in a way that my students can understand and not, going off on topics that they're not ready for, don't have the vocabulary for. But also even my own language skills, right? So I've been speaking Spanish for 15 years. I consider myself fluent. I have documentation from the country of Spain saying I have a certain level, but I am not necessarily speaking Spanish in my everyday life. And of course, there are topics that middle schoolers want to discuss that I personally have never in my life had to think about in this target language. And so I find that I'm continually having to learn. So before I enter my classroom and I'm preparing what I'm going to teach for that day, I'm rehearsing to some degree to make sure that, do I know how to say that? Maybe I have to Google it and just listen. Oh yeah, that's how that sounds. Maybe I have to, if I'm going to ask a question like, what's your favorite animal? I might need to know how to say ferret in the target language, which isn't something I've ever had to think about before. So sometimes I'm jotting a note of what I think they might ask me to kind of be ready for that. But then there's a certain degree where I have to be ready in the classroom to model for them what language learning looks like. And so they may ask me a question and I don't know how to say that in target language. And that is the moment where I remind them that I've been speaking Spanish now for 15 years. I am fluent by every measurement that you could say, but I will never know every single word in Spanish. But we don't know that in our native language either. If I hand you a novel by Charles Dickens, are you going to know every single word in there? I doubt it, because there's words in there you're not using. But you have the ability to learn those words. And in the same way, we have the ability to keep learning that in our target language. And so I'm not embarrassed or afraid to pull up, an online dictionary and look something up, because they also need to know how to do that when they hit a word they don't know. Or I need to teach them how to talk around a topic. That circumlocution, when you don't know exactly what you want to say, but you have other words that would get you pretty close, because that's a real world skill. When they're in an environment where they need to use that language and I'm not there to be their coach and their guide, I want them to know how to learn a language. And those are the skills that I can model for them right there in my classroom. So those are ways that I feel like I'm continuing to learn, grow as a language teacher.
So that's great. Well, as we bring things to a close, what advice would you have to someone teaching Hebrew, Greek, Latin, who really want to add more comprehensive input to their classroom?
Yeah. I think my first comment would be just go for it. Try not to second guess yourself too much, because it really is such an enjoyable approach to language learning, both for the student and for the teacher. I feel like you yourself are engaging in the language in a fresh and an interesting way, and you're helping them discover there's a reason why you're teaching them. It's because you enjoy this language, right? Or you think it's valuable and important. And so when you can help your students see how this language is actually used, we're not learning about the language is the actual thing that we're using in class. That's exciting. We're passing on that joy and excitement to our students, right? So I think just, let yourself embrace it. But I also think we need to give ourselves a lot of grace, because when we are teaching with a comprehensible input focus, we are not going to be necessarily great at it on day one. We have to hone our storytelling skills. We have to hone our own personal language skills. We have to hone how to facilitate that in the room and in the discussion. We have to be willing to say, okay, that visual did not communicate what I thought it did, so let me figure out a different way to do that next time. One of the advantages that I had was, unlike most middle school, high school language classrooms where you start in August and you finish in June. For me, mine are actually semesters. So I did a semester in the fall and I'm doing a semester in the spring. So in January, I got to hit the reset button, which was actually incredibly beneficial for my own personal learning how to teach a language in this way, because I got to see how much they learned and how much I learned. And then I got to try again in January all over again. And so I'm honing my skills, and I'm not perfect yet, but if I continue to hone my craft, then I am excited about how much better it can even be the next time around.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll bring this to a close for today. And as I said, I've been wrapping up comprehensible input, a number of episodes up to this point. And so we're about to close that out. Next week, I'm going to do kind of a summary review of everything we've been talking about and move on to some new topics from there. So next week, I hope you can join us. And in the meantime, thank you, Katie.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you can come again sometime.
Appreciate that.
Have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.